Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. We're going to wait another minute or two for some last-minute stragglers, and then we'll get started. All right, everyone, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And as people trickle in, they can join us when they can. But good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jeffrey Nahm, and I'm the Deputy Director of Programs of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, also known as YPFP. YPFP works to develop the abilities of future foreign policy leaders. We do this by providing YPFP members with capacity building programs, engaging events, a global community of peers, and opportunities to elevate their voices through writing and publication. Today, we are very delighted to have Congressman Ami Bera join us to talk about his experiences and insights regarding the Southeast Asia region and foreign policy in general. Before I introduce Congressman Bera, I have a few administrative items. Today's event will start with a discussion between the Congressman and I. This will then be followed by a Q&A session for the audience. Please feel free to submit your questions using the chat function at the bottom right of your screen, and I can read them out loud as they come in. Or if you would like to read your question out loud to the Congressman, please raise your hand and I will call on you. Please also remain on mute throughout the conversation in order to reduce background noise. If you experience any bandwidth issues, try turning off your video to improve the connection. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Congressman Ami Bera. Congressman Ami Bera has represented California's 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2013. Representative Bera serves as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-proliferation. He's also the longest serving Indian American member of Congress in history. Congressman, thank you again for joining us for what I know will be a very great discussion about your work and U.S. foreign policy.
Great, thanks for having me on. Let's start the discussion.
Great. So let's just start off with a little bit about yourself. Can you briefly speak to us about how you developed your interest in foreign policy and politics and eventually made your way into Congress?
You know, so I grew up in a family of immigrants. My parents immigrated from India in the 1950s. So, you know, we would always talk about politics at the dinner table. Grew up watching Walter Cronkite. You guys are not going to know who that is, but, you know, a little bit beyond your generation. So was always interested in politics, was politically engaged in high school, college, but then went off to medical school and kind of started down that path. Always felt like I would work behind the scenes, knew all our local electeds and so forth, and then got involved in Barack Obama's 2008 campaign pretty early on in 2007, when folks were like, he's not going to get elected, it's going to be Hillary or it'll be John Edwards. And lo and behold, he got elected. Foreign policy is not what drove me to run for Congress. So I knew President Obama would work on healthcare, and being a doctor, having done a bunch of things in healthcare, said I could sit on the sidelines or I could get in the game. When I got elected in 2013, you know, I could not get on either one of the healthcare committees. I was the only Indian American member of Congress at that point, and I would get more press coverage in India than I would in the United States. So that's what led me to the Foreign Affairs Committee and to the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee. What surprised me when I got on the Foreign Affairs Committee was how little focus was on Asia and how many people were focused on the Middle East and North Africa. And, you know, just started doing things there, started working on my interests and working on US India. You know, that led to a lot of US Korea stuff, and ultimately realized that that's where I wanted to cut my teeth on foreign affairs. So, and it's been great. I think the Indo-Pacific region is going to be the most dynamic region and challenging, but also the one with most opportunities in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. Like a lot of times, including yourself, but a lot of younger people as well, don't necessarily know their set path, and they kind of go through things, whether due to opportunity or changed interest, and eventually land where they end up wanting to be. So I think, kind of to your point, there's been a major shift in the geopolitical focus from the Middle East region to the Southeast Asian region, specifically players like China. It's actually funny. I was covering this hearing you held a few weeks ago on Southeast Asian ties. And during the conversations, there was a lot of focus on things like digital policy and digital trade agreements with partners in the region. Can you talk to us a little bit about what this encompasses and how you think the US should pursue these efforts?
Sure, absolutely. Now, I would also go back and say, as one of the 28 Democrats in the House that supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I would still ideally say, let's get, at this point, CPTPP passed, because I do think that creates a framework for movement of goods, commerce, security in the region. Short of the Biden administration, trying to put the United States back into CPTPP, I think what we ought to do is a digital trade agreement. We've had lots of conversations with countries in the region, as well as members of Congress. And I think there's a lot of interest in doing that. What digital trade talks, is really all about is so much of our economy, the finance side of things is all digital. Where you localize data, what are data privacy rules? And if we don't write those rules, someone else is going to write those rules, in this case, China. And I think most of the countries in the region would prefer to have a different set of rules that would talk about digital privacy, movement of data, and so forth. And, so it's complicated because most of the public doesn't understand it. But that's our job as elected officials, is to go out there, explain it to our constituents, and talk about why it's good for our economy as well as their pocketbooks.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely been a shift towards more digital focus. I know that the State Department recently announced that they're opening up a new cyber bureau kind of focused on topics like these. So clearly the government is going towards this direction. Congress is going towards this direction and focus. So a lot of things are trending in the right direction, I think. So kind of still touching upon the China topic. China, obviously has such a large economic influence, and this is, such a recurring theme. Can you tell us a little bit about your recent bipartisan bill about countering China's economic coercion, as well as any other major pieces of legislation related to that?
Sure. So that bill really is about understanding how China uses its economic bandwidth to influence other countries, influence policy in the region. And what I mean by that is, let's go back a few years in the Trump administration, when there really was heightened tensions between North Korea and South Korea. We made the decision to deploy THAAD batteries to South Korea for their defensive purposes. China retaliated by saying, okay, we're gonna withdraw all economic tourists. Like, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in South Korea. Had a huge impact on South Korea's economy. To this day, they haven't fully recovered from the impact. That's what I would say was economic coercion. Using your economic power to coerce other countries to do what you want them to do, or punish them if they don't do what you want them to do. And you've seen that in a bunch of different places. You see that, with Australia. Australia talked about COVID origins and so forth. China didn't like that, so they banned, meat products, livestock from Australia, and so forth. And now Aussie-Sino relationships are really at an all-time low. So it's how China uses its economic power to influence policy in other countries. And
Mhm.
that bill really is about better understanding how China uses that and then getting a sense of how we should combat that coercion.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we see sort of their coercion in a lot of different ways. I know, past couple of years there have been instances where they've exerted their influence on large companies, large U.S. companies, or even sporting organizations. So
Look at
their
what
reach is
happened to the
very
NBA,
widespread. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So, I mean, and again, in the 21st century, that probably isn't the right way to do business.
Hmm. No, I completely agree. Um, it almost seems like a lot of the smaller countries within the Southeast Asian region need to kind of play a balancing act between, balancing their economic almost reliance on China with, principles that align closely to ours, such as human rights and democracy. How do you see the U.S. kind of helping them facilitate that balancing act, as well as just navigating between those two polar opposites almost?
Yeah, so how I've approached it and how I think the Biden administration is approaching this is we can't ask the countries in the region to choose the United States or China. Yeah, that's not a choice that they can make. On the flip side, though, if we lead with a certain set of values, if we lead with a rules-based order, I think most of those countries will come our direction. If you think about, I was in Manila in fall of 2019 before the pandemic shut down travel. Relations with the Philippines were really at a low point with the United States. Duterte was leaning much more towards China. Fast forward to where we are today, Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, the paramilitary boats harassing Filipino fishermen are moving the Filipinos in our direction. You see that in maritime issues around Indonesia. You see that in issues around sovereignty and the waterways around Vietnam. So China is moving in a very aggressive direction that's pushing countries in our direction, and we should be receptive to that. But we should also meet them at a place of values, and I think that's bringing it back to digital trade. I think the countries want a set of rules that all of them can adhere to, but that China has to play by as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a good approach to find that median instead of almost forcing an ultimatum, because it's a tough decision for a lot of these countries. So kind of playing off of that, I know you are leading a congressional delegation later this week to a lot of the countries in those regions, talking about bilateral trade, security, things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you hope to accomplish through that or afterwards after that?
Sure. Although we just came back, so we were in Thailand last week and Indonesia, and the point of going to Thailand was twofold: one, to get a sense of where Thailand is right now, but two, to get proximity to Myanmar. Right, because Burma, Myanmar, there's a real dilemma there. We don't want Myanmar to go into a civil war. The Tatmadaw probably is not going anywhere. We're not negotiating with Tatmadaw. What are the next tools that we have? We can ramp up additional sanctions, but those sanctions probably don't have the desired effect of getting the Tatmadaw, the military junta, to the table to negotiate. They probably disproportionately impact the people of Myanmar. The civil disobedience, the civil servants that are fighting back against the military junta, they seem to be digging in. And again, how do we avoid a civil war, which the humanitarian crisis certainly could be bad. That was what we focused on in Thailand a bit. In Indonesia, we focused on the importance of the region. Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world, most populous Muslim country in the world. How do we work with Indonesia as a leader in ASEAN to build a stronger relationship between the United States and ASEAN, United States and Southeast Asia, but then also to address some of these issues in the region, whether that's maritime security, whether that's Myanmar, whether that's supply chains and supply chain redundancy. So really fruitful trip. I think we got very high level access, and I think it was important to continue to let the Southeast Asian countries know that they're very important in their own right. This is not about us versus China. It's about the United States building a stronger relationship with Southeast Asia.
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of potential threats or weaknesses within the dynamics in that region. But on the flip side, there's also a lot of opportunities. So during the peak of COVID and also the aftermath of the peak, it kind of exposed a lot of the supply chain resilience, I should say lack of resilience and reliance on China for goods such as rare earth minerals, solar panels, things like that. Solar panels, which are, for example, mass produced in Xinjiang at kind of the expense of human rights. So how do you see the US kind of working with our partners in that region to increase our supply chain resilience despite of China to avoid situations that we saw due to COVID or any other future global threat?
Yes, I think the pandemic exposed not just the United States, but a lot of the world on its over-reliance on a single source, in this case, China, for raw ingredients and supplies that are critical supplies in many ways. So I think, I've had conversations with European parliamentarians and others, Australians. We're all thinking about how to build redundant supply chains. So some of that, where it makes sense, we'll reshore and bring that back to the United States. But a lot of it is low cost, low margin work. So can we strategically look at countries like Vietnam or Indonesia or Thailand and say, well, that work's not going to come back to the United States. Can we build that redundancy in some of these countries? Again, I'm a believer in if you have economic investment, you bring countries closer together and tie economies together. So, so I think that's an opportunity. We talk about rare earth elements. Vietnam's got an abundance. Australia's got an abundance there. So can we build those industries as well?
Yeah, especially since things like rare earth minerals are so important for a lot of the technologies of tomorrow, such as electric vehicles, batteries, things like that. So definitely something we need to take a close eye on. So kind of switching topics a little bit towards the Central Asia region. Since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, there have been some concerns of the US's commitment to some of its allies and friends. So can you tell us a little bit about what the US and Congress are doing to reaffirm our commitments to these groups that we're a part of, such as the Quad or AUKUS or other groups within the region that we work closely with such as ASEAN?
Sure. So I would not equate the withdrawal from Afghanistan to commitments in Japan or Korea, even our policy commitments towards Taiwan or elsewhere. We were on Afghanistan for over 20 years. I think we invested tens of billions of dollars in trying to build up the country, et cetera. And so it wasn't unusual. Both President Trump and President Biden on the campaign trail said that they would be withdrawing. I think what surprised everyone was the rapidity with which the Afghan government collapsed. That's a whole nother conversation as to what went wrong there. And I think we do have to do oversight to get a better understanding. But it's not easy to build democracy. Democracy has to come from within. And I think we gave our best shot. The difference when you think about a Japan or Korea or other countries in the region is they do have a national identity, but they are going to step up and fight for themselves. But we also have long-standing commitments. So again, I wouldn't equate what happened in Afghanistan to our relationship and security commitments to other countries in the region.
That's a good point you bring up. To the audience members, I'm going to be wrapping up fairly shortly. So, take some time to think about any questions you might have for the congressman, and then, start sending it in the chat or raise your hand once the Q&A session does start. But we will be starting shortly. So my last question to you, the Biden administration appears to have taken an approach focused more on global cooperation as opposed to one of isolationism that seemed to be the recurring theme of the previous administration. So this involves more focus on elevating our diplomats abroad, as well as our civil service here at home. And I know there have been some hearings both by the Senate and the House on modernizing and improving the State Department in general. What do you believe are the most important issues or best strategic approaches to improving the abilities of our State Department?
So I think a couple things. I agree with you that the Biden administration is taking a multilateral approach, rebuilding relationships, building coalitions to address the challenges and opportunities that we see in the 21st century. With regards to kind of building diplomatic capacity, I also agree with you. I think the State Department, USAID, other tools of soft power and diplomacy probably have been neglected. You certainly saw a loss of mid-career talent during the 4 years of the Trump administration. Can we entice some of that talent to come back into State Department, USAID, and elsewhere? That would be one thing that I would, certainly urge the Biden administration, if there's opportunities to get some of that talent back, because those really were the mid-career diplomats that were going to be the next generation of leaders. I also think we have to do a concerted effort going into colleges, universities, and really recruiting young professionals like all of you to enter foreign service, talking about the opportunity to serve our country, talking about what the foreign service means. And it doesn't have to just be the foreign service, because a lot of State Department and USAID are civil servants as well, talking about those careers. And I think we do have to recruit a diverse workforce, gender diversity, ethnic diversity. And then how do we make that ladder of career opportunity so folks can continue climbing that ladder over a career?
No, after hearing about all the intended strategies and approaches to improving the State Department, I'm pretty optimistic about the direction we're going. Just the overall greater emphasis on diplomacy as opposed to, maybe more hard power approaches. Okay, so now is the time for the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to chat it in the general group or direct message me, or raise your hand if you would like to be called out loud. So it looks like, Rachel, you have your hand raised. You can go ahead and ask the Congressman a question.
Hi, thank you, Jeffrey. Congressman, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been really educational to listen to this conversation.
Thank you.
So I'm really curious. I'm thankful that you brought up the situation in Myanmar. Obviously, I think most folks know at this point the role that American tech corporations have played in the Tatmada's capability to surveil and to spread propaganda through the local population. That's been integral in their power grab, essentially. So I'm curious what you would comment on, what we can do here to influence the situation over there through, what our tech corporations are doing.
Yeah, so that's a broader question, not just isolated to Myanmar, but throughout the world in terms of how technology, how information, social media, et cetera, gets used or disabused in various countries, and including our own. So I do think it's a seminal question that we're going to have to grapple with in Congress, but we're going to also have to grapple with it as a society in terms of freedom of information, freedom of flows, because we saw how that played out here in our own democracy. With regards to Myanmar, I do think it does make sense for us to have a better sense of how both the Tatmadaw use information and tech and social media, but also how some of the civil society groups and others use that. Because what you don't want is, if you shut things down, the potential of inadvertently hurting some of these other groups. more broadly, I'm very worried that the Tatmadaw are going to be very resistant to external pressure because they've been here before. And what we don't want to do is isolate them in a way that disproportionately impacts the general public and general society. So this is going to, I'm very worried about what the next few months will bring in Myanmar and how we avoid devolving into a civil war.
Thank you for your response, Congressman. Adam, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, thanks, Jeffrey. And thank you, Congressman Bera, for being with us tonight. Really appreciate your time. And just as a question sort of for the broader Southeast Asian region, looking historically at what the US has done, going back to like the Vietnam War, we've got plenty of low-hanging fruit wins, I guess you could say, in that they only cost maybe $25 to $75 million, but it involves stuff like cluster munitions cleanup in Cambodia, Agent Orange exposure cleanup in Vietnam, or landmine cleanup in Laos. And those are relatively low-cost wins that the US could do. So in your experience, why haven't you seen maybe the initiative there to pursue those low-cost wins in your time in Congress?
So I'd agree with you. I think those are relatively inexpensive ways to build goodwill with these countries where we have some legacy issues that we have a responsibility to. I'd have to go back, but I think President Obama made some commitments. When I think he visited Laos and spoke directly to that issue. I'd have to go back and look at whether we as the U.S. government followed up with the resources to help clean up mines and the like in Laos or Cambodia. But I agree with you. I think those are easy things for us to do that we probably have that we do have a responsibility given our history in the region. So I think it is a good way to build goodwill.
Thank you for that. And Colin, you can go ahead and answer or ask your question.
Thank you for being here, Congressman. One thing I was hoping you could answer is where you see us drawing the line in terms of eliciting support from regional nations in countering Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, even if those nations themselves may not be in line with our own liberal democratic values. More recently, such as with the Philippines and their backsliding under Duterte, and Cambodia and Vietnam especially, which may, primarily Vietnam, being a possible partner in countering Chinese influence, but also not being in line with our values either.
Yeah, so I think that's always going to be the balance. Let's take Cambodia, for instance. They're about to assume the chairmanship of ASEAN. And one thing when we're in the region that we discussed is how would Cambodia use its chairmanship vis-a-vis Myanmar, and vis-a-vis China has concerns about a civil war in Myanmar as well. Cambodia obviously has closer relations to China. Is there an opportunity for Cambodia to use its chairmanship to help us find a path forward in Myanmar? That allows the United States and China to work together. India is also a variable there. So it's finding that balance. Vietnam obviously is not a liberal democracy, but it is a country that wants to have a closer relationship with the United States, partly because of tensions with China, partly because the Vietnamese actually have positive feelings towards the American people and who we are as a country. So I think you have to find that right balance that they may not be a liberal democracy, and unfortunately some of those countries will point back to January 6th. They'll point back to what's happening to democracy in the United States, and it becomes a little bit harder for us to say, well, wait a minute, you've got to make these reforms, because they'll push back on us on some of that. So it's finding that right balance and building those relationships and taking a long view.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good idea that like diplomacy is not a zero-sum approach. You're not going to get everything you want, but ideally you get as much as you can from the partners you work with. So we do have some questions in the chat, but I'll go ahead and call on you, Brandon, and then I'll go ahead and read the rest of the questions afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. Congressman, President Biden met with Xi Jinping, and one of the points of discussion that came up was Taiwan. It's been in a source of great tensions between the United States and China over the past several months. And I know there's been some legislation proposed in Congress, in support of Taiwan. I was wondering how you saw what kind of role you think Congress can play in supporting Taiwan and its relationship with Taiwan. Where do you see that going forward?
Yeah, so Taiwan's complicated. I would always start by, we as the United States have not changed our policy. We still support a one China policy, but we also support the people of Taiwan, their sovereignty in choosing their path forward. Xi Jinping has actually changed their approach to Taiwan with this level of aggression that you're seeing, incursions into China's maritime space, into their air defense space. I use the term strategic deterrence because our desire is to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, because I think that would create a real dilemma in the region. And right now, the status quo has been pretty prosperous for the entire region. Certainly for China, it has been. And yeah, when I talk about deterrence, it's not just military deterrence. If China were to invade Taiwan, I think there would be huge economic consequences in terms of sanctions, isolation. There'd be huge political consequences. It wouldn't just be the United States versus China. You're seeing European Union parliamentarians talk about political isolation. You're seeing, in the Biden-Suga summit with Japan, you saw Taiwan prominently mentioned. So I do think there would be the consternation of the world if China were to aggressively, militarily move forward on a Taiwan reunification, let's say. I think that would be a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point. The US, I know, is heavily reliant on Taiwan for microchip production. So there's a lot of economic implications with something that could happen in that region, as well as military. So I'm gonna go ahead and read some of the questions from the chat as well as direct messages. So this question is, how do you see the economic impacts of countries like Thailand, considering the situation in Myanmar, and how does it affect US foreign policy within the region?
Yeah, so Thailand's very worried that if Myanmar does devolve into a civil war, they'll have a refugee crisis on their border. They share a long border with Myanmar. So that's part of the reason for engaging the Thais in how do we avoid that? How do we work together to find some path forward and resolution? That's also part of the reason, given ASEAN's central role here, Myanmar is a member of ASEAN, for having visited Indonesia, because they really are kind of a leader in ASEAN, and they've been the one country that's really been pushing ASEAN to take a tougher stance on the junta in Myanmar. We're going to have to work with the countries in that region because they stand to suffer the most if Myanmar goes into a civil war. So how do we work with those countries who can work with a fellow ASEAN member nation in Myanmar to try to find a path forward, try to find an off-ramp? And that off-ramp probably does include the Tatmadaw and some government in Myanmar going forward. That's just not going to be easy, because I think civil society, the professional class, and the military are so far apart right now. And if it does go into a season of violence, that they're not going to get closer together. They're going to move further apart.
That's a great point. The next question is related to that. So when it comes to the international human rights violations that are occurring in Myanmar, what has been the US's approach to address that, and why haven't they maybe done more or used different approaches to that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've condemned, what's happened to the Rohingya. Many members of Congress called it a genocide. And what's complicated about Myanmar is there's so many ethnic minority groups there. And even if we wanted to come out with a statement saying, hey, we're going to support the government in exile that Myanmar is creating against the military junta, what you'll notice is the Rohingya aren't part of that government. And members of Congress have raised that question. I raised it when I was meeting with folks from this, the government in exile, is, well, what is, if you were to prevail and the junta were to relinquish power and you were to create a Myanmar government, are you guys going to include the Rohingya or not? And so that it's super complicated, because again, if you're going to have an inclusive, you have this population of people that right now don't have a country. They are fighting side by side with the resistance groups and the other ethnic minorities. But if they prevail, are they going to have citizenship rights? Are they going to be part of Myanmar? And, those are complicated issues that, have to get resolved. So.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult to try to balance that and, address the people such as the Rohingya that are almost disenfranchised with the country they live in. So definitely considerations we need to have. So the next question is regarding the State Department. Are you aware of any small units or departments in general, I guess not necessarily just the State Department, that are working on bringing in innovative or analytical tools in order to get a better understanding of policy and negotiations? And have you started to incorporate them?
I'm not, but certainly in a broader sense, analytic tools, artificial intelligence, big data sets that help us better have an understanding of what's happening in a particular part of the world, or probably does make sense. Not my area of expertise, but I think it does make sense. And how do we use big data and AI to empower our diplomats and give us better options and thinking through things? But again, I'm not aware if there's a particular department.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, there's a new cyber bureau being stood up within the State Department, as well as a new special envoy for emerging technology. So I think a lot of that sort of stuff is kind of within their purview. So looking forward to how they incorporate all that within policy and diplomacy. So the next question has to do with the Quad. The Quad has made commitments to collaborate and create a resilient supply chain, with focusing on creating a new COVID-19 value chain and expanding renewable energy. How will this disrupt the supply chain as the world seemingly wants to gradually depend less on Chinese supply chains, as the Quad was met with unease by ASEAN?
Yeah, so I think the Quad is getting elevated partly because of Chinese actions, right? So, Chinese behavior towards Australia really has pushed Australia in our direction, where, 3-4 years ago, I would have said the Aussies took a very laissez-faire approach to China. They're very much, there's a very much anti-China ferment in Australia right now. India, a historically non-aligned country, given what's happening on their northern border with Chinese aggression, public sentiment in India has very much shifted from China and has made the Quad much more important. Japan, certainly they've historically had a tense relationship. They're watching what's happening in the East China Sea. They're happy what's happening with Taiwan. So, I think the Quad being elevated to the leaders level was a really big step. And then coming out with real tangibles, first on vaccine production and distribution in the region. I think those are all real positives. I think, it'll be, a relationship that's more than just geopolitical and geostrategic. That's also based on shared economies. You touched on supply chains. I do think within the Quad, there's the opportunity to think about supply chain redundancy, but then the Quad working with ASEAN. I don't see the two in competition with one another. I actually see that as complementary. And I think if we're smart, Japan makes huge investments in Southeast Asia. We actually make big investments in Southeast Asia. How do we leverage those, our investments in a very strategic way to bring those countries closer to us?
No,
And when I
all
say
great.
that, I'm also talking about Japan, Australia, India.
Mhm. Yeah, no, all great points. I think there definitely are a lot of opportunities for collaboration within those two groups.
Yeah, I've probably got time for one, maybe two more questions.
No, sounds good. So we'll do the last few. So can you speak to the role of development aid in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, I think hugely important. We touched, an earlier questioner touched on the small amount of dollars it would take to help Laos or Cambodia address some of the munition issues from the Vietnam War era. I think that that's the right thing to do, but it also engenders goodwill. I think we should think about things not as a counterweight to Belt and Road, but as what are the right investments for the countries in the region. I think we also should think about how we partner with, whether it's Japan, Australia, Korea, to leverage our investments, because all of us want the countries that we're investing in with aid and development to build the infrastructure, to open up their economies. That creates markets for us to sell our goods and services, but it also lifts them up. And historically, as people are started to lift out of poverty, they tend to choose democracy, not always, but that has been a formula that's been successful for us in terms of creating stable trading partners, but also stable allies. And you can look at Korea, you can look at Japan as great examples of that.
Thank you for your response. So I have one last question to ask. So based on your experiences in politics and foreign policy in general, do you have any tips or insights on how young individuals like us can best develop understanding, learn from the successes, but also avoid the failures seen throughout international history?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to have grown up in a household where we traveled a lot. My mom was a public school teacher. Dad was an engineer, and every other year we would go on some trip abroad. Obviously, having family ties to India, we'd go back to India, but we also drove a van around Europe. And I don't think enough Americans get a sense of what the rest of the world is like. And I think there's a danger in having a very insular view. So, by virtue of the fact that you guys are all young foreign policy professionals, you already understand that. You're already interested in what the rest of the world looks like. How do we get more of our fellow citizens engaged in the world? How do we also bring more of the world here? And I think we've gone backwards in immigration policy. And it's not a given what form of government's going to dominate the 21st century. You're seeing a lot of authoritarian, isolationist approaches. We've seen it here in our own country. I think that would be a shame if that form of government wins out, because the truth is the world's a much more interconnected place today than it was 30 years ago. We see that with the pandemic, but the information flows, movement of goods, people, services, two big oceans are not going to protect us. I mean, so we isolate ourselves at our own parish. Like, we have to be engaged with the rest of the world and engaged in a way that's probably different than what we did in the post-World War II era. Like, those 75 years, we really were the dominant world power and had a responsibility. I think we did a pretty remarkable job rebuilding the world rebuilding Europe, Japan, what Korea has been able to accomplish in the last 40 years. I do think not perfect, but we created a lot of peace and stability. The next 75 years are going to be different. And what does that look like? Is it, values of human rights, of democracy, of free markets, or is it a different set of values? And Xi Jinping has really put out his vision of where China is going, and it's different from how we see the world. So I think that to me is like a seminal battle of values. It's fine for us to compete with China. I actually think competition's a good thing, but what are the playing rules going to be like? So I would encourage all of you to stay engaged in foreign policy. Think about the Foreign Service. But regardless of what you do professionally, continue to engage with the rest of the world, because I think it's super important.
Mhm.
So again, thank you for inviting me on. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you again. I think those closing remarks really hit the nail on the head. So Congressman Bera, I want to thank you again for joining us for what has been a really lively and enjoyable discussion. I know I'm going to personally take a lot away from it. So, I really appreciate that. I know our audience will as well. So, I also want to thank the YPFP members in attendance today for spending time with us and for their continued engagement with our global community. So please keep an eye out for upcoming events in our newsletter and our website at ypfp.org. Take care of yourselves, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you again, Congressman.
Thank you.